7 years since the deadly Marikana Massacre, and government has been widely criticized for not doing enough for the families of those who lost their lives. Joining me now in studio is Pop Crew spokesperson Richard Mamabolo and Gareth Newham, who's the head of Justice and Violence Prevention at the Institute for Security Studies. Also joining us is my colleague Bongiwe Zwane, who's really been working overtime to bring us the best coverage of this Marikana remembrance.
I've tried.
So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today. I mean, when I think of the police's role in the Marikana Massacre, one thing that sticks out for me is the events that happened at Scene 2. And why I say that is because when you look at the report by the Farlam Commission, there was so much confusion on what really happened at Scene 2, where 17 people were killed. And I mean, Gareth, I know that you guys last year around this time, if I'm not mistaken, released a report called The Sound of Gunfire, in which you speak about, try and give us more insight into the killings that happened at Scene 2, but also look at the role and the leadership played by police in the deaths of the Marikana miners. And so I would like you, if you could, just to give us some background on that report and really what was contained in it.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we need to start with the issue of political and police leadership, because that is where flaws led to this very unfortunate incident occurring. We know that there had been violence in the run-up to the 16th.
Oh, Gareth, unfortunately, your mic is just giving us a few issues, and so we'll get your mic fixed. But I'll come to you then, Richard. When you look at the police's role in the Marikana Massacre and reflecting on all the support that you have given not only to the police officers but to some of the top government officials who were also implicated, the Ria Piegas, for example, do you still believe that the police were acting in trying to protect themselves from those miners?
Well, there were a lot of things that took place before the actual day on the 16th. You'd remember that 2 weeks before then, you had certain miners who were killed belonging to different unions. You had security guards killed. You had even police killed. So the expectation would have been that the National Management Forum, which was obviously responsible for directing police in the manners that they were supposed to react, would have obviously considered all those factors. And of course, going into such a situation would have definitely meant that there needed to be some precautions because already people had been killed. Now, we are not saying it had been correct. I think it's quite regrettable that there was a loss of life, but as things turned out, it was quite clear that police also felt that their lives were in danger.
Well, if I can just come in there, Richard, as you talk about the National Management Forum, one of the things that was very clear in the Marikana Commission was the fact that the minutes of that very extraordinary session that took place on this day 7 years ago, which was the day before the massacre that we now come to know, those minutes never made it into the public domain. In fact, just what appeared to, as retired Judge Ian Farlam found was that the minutes were inconclusive because that memory stick continued to be missing. And I will come to you, Gareth, about that. How then do we, as citizens, then still have faith in, the leadership of the SAPS? Because that was one of those moments that really put the spotlight on the lack of leadership and the lack of direction, because we still don't know to this day what was discussed in that session.
No, definitely. But in line with what you're raising, you would remember as well that obviously the functions of that forum would obviously be to ensure that you remedy the situation in light of what has been happening over the past weeks, where there have been a number of deaths. So there would have obviously been pressures. We might not know exactly what was discussed in detail, but of course, one of the elements that we think should have went into that was to look into how then do you ensure that public order policing becomes effective on the next day. So definitely there are no minutes and decisions were taken. We think perhaps there could have been time pressures because there were continuously people being killed during that time. And that, of course, is not to say that any form of death has been justified at all.
Yeah, and I mean, Gareth, I'll come back to you now that your mic is fixed to allow you the chance to continue with what you were saying earlier on.
Well, I think, as I was saying, it was a political and police leadership failure. That Special National Management Forum was where the decision was taken to go tactical. And we know from police practice that that's an operational commander's decision based on the events on the ground at the time. So there had been no deaths at that point for about 3 days. People were gathering on the Koppie, but there was no violence. It was not a public order policing operation. The tactical response team was brought in. And we know in the morning of the 16th, the police had really already made up their mind that they were going to start disarming and dispersing people. They had already been warned by senior police officials that that could lead to bloodshed. And this is where Ria Piecha and Commissioner Mbombo, the provincial commissioner, ignored those warnings and went ahead with the operation anyway. There was an earlier plan which would have resulted in no bloodshed if they had gone with it, but they'd had to wait for Friday. But they rushed the decision because they made the decision on the Wednesday. On Thursday morning, they said today's D-Day, and they unfolded this operation, which resulted in this large number, 112 people being shot and injured, 34 of them dying. And there were 2 scenes, as you mentioned. Scene 1 is what we've all seen on television footage, and the commission found that some of the police officers at scene 1, where 17 people died, may have thought that their lives were under threat because it was dusty, they saw people coming at them, they didn't know what was going on. But scene 2, which happened about half an hour later, the police could only provide some kind of justification for killing one of the 17 people that were killed there. So the Farm Commission had evidence that 17 people had been shot dead by the police. Most of them were hiding under rocks or under bushes behind rocks. And the police didn't give any account for 16 of the 17 deaths.
And Gareth, one of the things about that very scene too was the fact that some of the guys that were found there were found in a position that looked like their hands were tied behind their backs. And then another one was also found with what appeared to be a cable tie on their knee, and there were, you know, obviously all these arguments by their lawyers that they were shot execution style. But yet here we are, 7 years later, it doesn't look like anybody has taken responsibility for what happened behind those rocks.
Well, that I think is the big failure. This event, this massacre, should have resulted in a fundamental shift in policing, a relook at the police model being used, and fundamental police reform. Instead, the national leadership under Ria Piecha constructed a version of what happened there that was found not to be truthful. So there were severe challenges raised about their integrity. They weren't trying to say, this is a terrible event, we need to look at what happened, we need to have an objective investigation and make sure this never happens again. Their presentation to the Farm Commission was that every single killing was in self-defense, we've done nothing wrong and nothing needs to change.
But also one of the things, I'm sorry, Lindy, just to come in there, one of the things that, I mean, we're seeing now on screen are the findings against the police officers, and you're touching on a matter that was, you know, painstakingly tried to be probed in the commission, which is the plan, which then became known as the Scott's plan, because he was the commander at the time and only briefed the members from a back of a buggy with just a laptop, and that was a critical dispersal operation that they wanted to undertake. But do you get a sense that following that and looking at the Standing Order 262 that police then had at the time, are we anywhere near towards a better dispersal plan should another gathering of this kind come up, especially on the part of the SAPS?
I can say that I think that the police, in practice, did learn some lessons from Marikana. So, for example, they no longer utilize or bring R5, automatic weapons, to crowd management situations. They let the public order police, who are trained to disperse crowds in a peaceful manner if possible, they usually take command of these situations. Remember, at Marikana, it wasn't the public order police. They weren't part of the planning. Scott was a special task force commander, and he did the planning without knowledge or training in public order policing. So they trained for maximum use of force. Since 2014, there's been National Instruction 1 of 2014 around crowd gathering, and that really sets out in a lot more detail. There are some shortcomings there, but in a lot more detail how the police's approach to crowd gathering situations must be one to use as minimum force as possible, try and negotiate, try and get people to disperse peacefully. So we haven't seen another situation like this, and the police, I think, in practice for the last 7 years have tried not to bring maximum force to situations where people are in a crowd gathering situation.
And I mean, just speaking about maximum use of force, Richard, I think I'll come to you and speak about some of the recommendations that came out from the Farnham Commission's report. And one of them they spoke about was the demilitarization of the SAPS. They also spoke about the progress in first aid training, equipment of helicopters and with video cameras and. So I want to know from you, of those recommendations, what has been implemented and what can you say today? These are the lessons that we've learned from the Marikana massacre and this is what we've implemented.
Look, I think definitely lessons have been learned, but I think in line with what had been recommended, for us, what was most important had been the formation of a ministerial transformation task team, which was headed by the former Minister Mtetwa. Nkosinathi Nhleko rather. What had happened was that you would obviously look into conditions of service, look into standing orders and all those other aspects that would ensure that police are governed in a certain way. And of course, I think for us as a union, we have obviously been encouraging the SAPS to ensure that there's further training, there is increased staff complement, because those are some of the shortages that had actually prevented police from actually fulfilling some of the recommendations that come from the commission. So there are still a lot of outstanding things, and of course with the downsizing of police currently as it is happening, it seems like it's obviously not something that we'll obviously have within the short space of time.
And one of the outstanding things that you talk about, Richard, that we've seen in the previous slide is the fact that an inquiry into the fitness to hold office of the former National Police Commissioner, Ria Piecha, resulted in her axing. But we then saw the provincial Police Commissioner, Zugiswa Mbombo, retire and go well and not even have any charges or any inquiry brought against her. Is that one of the recommendations that you as a union are then chasing up to ensure that there is that inquiry that gets to sit, even though she's no longer a member of the SAPS?
Remember that Ria was not axed, she was actually suspended, and at the time when her term of office came to an end, she was still under suspension.
Yes.
And she did take the findings on review, so the matter has still not been decided as yet. So we are unable to comment really into detail on that part because the matter has still not
And when it
been
comes
concluded.
to the Northwest, the former Northwest Police Commissioner, because we know that with Piecha's case, it's still ongoing, but there's nothing happening with the former Northwest Police Commissioner. And that is, if you look at the footage, that's the person that even the Farlam Commission was kept on referring to when it talks about the D-Day. Today is the day we decide to end the violence.
Well, the Farlam Commission actually warns against certain statements issued by leaders which would be seen as provoking certain action from police. And we agree with that, of course. And I think, like we said, that everybody has learned a lesson from that day. I mean, just without necessarily taking you off course, looking at what happened, for example, in Johannesburg last week, where police had to retract from a situation, it has gotten to that point where police would not necessarily use force when they see that the situation could turn out to be what it had been like in the past. So there is more consideration for all these aspects. And of course, I think in line with what has been happening over the past 7 years, there has been significant changes. But again, the other challenge has been that police are now scared to act because immediately when they take certain action, they are found to be on the wrong. When they do not act as well, there are a lot of pressures which come our way to say police are not doing anything, they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. So those are the balances, the challenges which obviously need to be balanced out.
Yeah. And Gareth, I mean, last year the Institute held a seminar, how policing must change after Marikana. And I'm interested in finding out what came of that seminar. And when you listen to Richard speaking about some of the changes that they've made within the police force, is he believable? Do you believe what he's saying?
Well, as I said earlier, there has been a change in practice, but I think we haven't really seen a very clear measured plan of action to change things in such a way that the police, operational police on the ground, have to be concerned about whether they are acting too harshly or not harshly enough. And I think this really speaks to the National Development Plan recommendations. Because this issue was a failure of police leadership, and because police organizations can only reform when they are led by only the best possible women and men available, those with the most experience, expertise, and whose integrity is beyond question. There has not been any accountability for, as you've been mentioning, a lot of those commanders. Ria Piecha was allowed to resign. The board that she was subjected to recommended that the president fire her. She brought that matter to review, but it would be very interesting to see, since this was well over a year ago, why the case actually isn't being pushed forward. Because the president could have acted on that. And then secondly, the Commissioner Bombo was allowed to retire early, But there are a number of other senior commanders which the Farnham Commission said action should be taken about against them. Disciplinary action for lying under oath, for concealing evidence, for example, losing the memory stick and not being able to come forward with that kind of stuff. None of that has taken place. And so, and as my colleague from POPCO will know, one of the big challenges in the South African Police Service is that when something goes wrong, it's typically the lower level officers on the streets who get held accountable. But what we need to see, and that's the big shift, when the top managers make decisions that lead to their own officers' safety being compromised, those officers at Marikana had their safety compromised, and when people die as a result, they must be the first to be held personally and directly accountable. And that hasn't changed.
And if you then talk about that leadership, because yes, it's true that we do see the foot soldiers on the ground being the ones that take accountability. Isn't it then one of a sore point when you look at 7 years later, it's still not clear who issued the instruction for them to use force, maximum force on the 16th of August?
Indeed, and I think that's what speaks to the lack of the implementation of the main recommendation, the first recommendation, that there is a reconstruction of the scene and that an independent prosecutorial-led investigation finds out exactly what happened there. Now, because of lack of resources, that has been somewhat done, but that's why we brought out that research report, The Sound of Gunfire, because there's no document out there telling us what happened there. So we went through all the evidence again and put forward an evidence-based account of what happened, simply just in a fact-based situation, who was located where and who shot when at what time. But it was clear that at that second scene, there weren't any instructions given to shoot. The police officials at that second scene were just shooting on their own accord, which is illegal. You can only use lethal force if you really reasonably believe that your life is under threat or somebody else's life is under threat. And as there was no evidence to that account being brought before the Farnham Commission, and to date we still don't know lawfully what happened there. But that lack of accountability, that lack of investigation, that lack of official account of what actually happened there is one of the big sore points. Because how do you change policing to make sure that you get the best leadership so that operational commanders are well looked after, they're well resourced, they get the proper guidance that they need, resources and training, if the leadership isn't changing? And right now, there's been no real change in the way that the leaders are appointed, in the way the leaders are held accountable since Marikana. And that's where the big change needs to happen if we're going to see a shift in policing where we see police being highly trusted by the population. We know from various statistics, the Victims of Crime Survey by Statistics South Africa, that since 2011-12, most years, virtually every year since then, there's been a decline in people's approval ratings of the police. And that is because people are not experiencing the police in a different way, which they would if they had proper leadership.
And Richard, doesn't then that then add to the post-traumatic stress disorder that then police officers find themselves having to undergo, particularly if, as a foot soldier, you have to take responsibility for something that you were given an instruction for, and secondly, you then have to deal with the lack of trust in the public, from the public to police, and then you have to deal with the fact that such, scores of people died on a day like that.
Absolutely.
What kind of support is being provided to police officers? Because we do have police officers that worked in Marikana on the day and that are still walking around.
Look, I think even besides Marikana, police have been confronted with a lot of challenges, and of course, part of those challenges are, of course, from a managerial point of view, So the kind of leadership we have, of course, POPCRO has on numerous occasions been raising a lot of, concerns about the way the SAPS is structured currently, and of course, the lack of resources as well has prevented a lot of things from happening. But I think we should also, because I think. Besides focusing on what the role of managers and how they relate to police should be, those are basics, of course. But we should obviously also look into solutions beyond policing alone. I think, for example, from what I get from the ISS has been that their main focus is around what exactly the actions that police took. But perhaps we should obviously have a discussion about what leads to these events, the kind of socioeconomic challenges that communities face, the kind of general conditions that would lead to police having to react in certain instances. I think maybe the discussion should be broadened up to that extent. But again, I think from our view, the issue around leadership has been a problem. And of course, if there are no funds, I mean, some of the recommendations that come out from the Farnham Commission are yet to be implemented. That is true. So you cannot now have something that is conclusive. We obviously need to get more funding in ensuring that we improve all aspects of policing.
All right. I think that's where we'll end this conversation. Thank you so much for joining me. You will have heard Richard Mamabolo from Pub Crew saying the issue of leadership is still a problem. It's been
Indeed.
a problem 7 years ago when Marikana happened. It's still a problem now.
And the fact that, you know, it does look like police are still continuing to struggle. And perhaps if I can just bring this in just as a final point to just the two of you. The fact that we keep looking at the fact that some of these cases were referred to the NPA for them to be investigated. But Gareth was still seeing only that group of William Mbembe being the ones that are being held to account, and the accountabilities for the days before. But there is no movement on the 16th of August. Who should be held to account for those particular deaths that happened in full view of the public, as well as the ones at Sin 2?
Well, that's the Independent Police Investigative Directorate and the National Prosecuting Authority. Did they do a thorough investigation? What is the status of those cases? Why have decisions not yet been taken? Because that's where those cases are at the moment.
And I mean, Richard, we've seen you throw your weight behind, Pub Crew rather, throw their weight behind Rea Pierre. You've also shown your support for those 8 people that have been arrested in connection with the Marikana massacres. How have you continued to support them throughout the years?
Well, I think we've made it clear that when they were there, they were actually acting out their constitutional mandate. They were deployed by the SAPS. And I think one of the things we came out clearly to say was that the SAPS should then take a role in representing them through their court processes.
And shouldn't then the person, because they were carrying out a mandate, as you say, shouldn't then the person on whose mandate they were acting take responsibility?
Look, we would agree to some of those, but again, like we said that earlier, that some of the recommendations for further investigations, according to the Commission, have not been concluded. So only time will tell. When they are concluded, then we'll get to the final analysis and obviously make a determination on the basis of that analysis.
All right. Well, it seems I've cut this conversation off a little too early. So let's take a quick ad break and we'll be back with this conversation when we return. Stay with us.